which is a pilgrimage in Islam. And that book will be out in, June in the United Kingdom and July in the U.S. And so I want to talk. I'm going to talk mostly generally about the book, and then maybe during the Q&A you can ask specific questions. So I became interested in Islamic pilgrimage when I was in graduate school. I was studying for my doctorate, and I was actually focusing on this project on Islamophobia. But I was sent some information about grants with the Luce Foundation. And I decided just to take a chance and apply for it. And so what I applied for was to go study Shi'i architecture, pilgrimage architecture in Iran. Right before I was supposed to leave, they had the Green Revolution, so I could not go because it was too dangerous. So I went to Syria instead, but this was before Syria got very dangerous, before ISIS, before all that. So what I did was I studied the mirror mosaic that are inside the Shia shrines, okay? And they're called, in Persian, they're called Aine Kari, which means mirror work. And so while I was doing my dissertation, I also published on this topic. And so even though right as I was ending graduate school, I got a job, I started teaching, I never stopped being interested in pilgrimage, right? And so I kept on kind of coming back to it. I taught a course on pilgrimage, which was comparative pilgrimage of all different religions. And so what basically happened, how this book came about, was a friend of mine, a scholar at Duke named Omid Safi, who you might know, yeah. He's actually a very close friend. He performed my nikah for my marriage. He's kind of like an uncle, and we often talk about career stuff, academic stuff. And we start to talk about how there's no good text to teach pilgrimage in Islam, right? So basically what we have is we have many, 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 many books on Hajj and Umrah. Then we have a small selection of books on Shi'i pilgrimage, but only 12 are Shi'is, only Ithna Ashariya that believe in 12 imams. We have nothing on Ismailis, we have nothing on Zaydis, we have nothing on these other groups, right? And we also do not have a good text on like all of these pilgrimages together. And so we were talking about this, and I was kind of complaining, and Omid said, you should write this book. And so that's what I ended up doing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this. Now, one of the things that I really thought about while I was writing this book is, why do Western scholars only focus on Hajj, right? Because the studies of like Twelver Shi'ism and of Sufi pilgrimage are mostly by scholars in Europe, or scholars in Indonesia, or scholars in Morocco or other places. And what I think it is that we have a problem in Western scholarship, a bias of only focusing on those religious traditions that are based on the textual canon, right? And the reason for that, and it's the same problem with scholars of Buddhism, is that because the Protestant Reformation focuses so much on the text, right? So there's a over reliance or over focusing on traditions that you find written about in texts, right? But as you know, and as we learned from the other speaker, there's many traditions, right, that are not found in texts, but they're things that people do, right, who may be Buddhist or maybe Hindu or maybe Muslim. So this is a really problematic bias in Western scholarship, because when you look at books on world religions or Islam, and they say, okay, this is what Muslims do, they just say they do Hajj. They don't talk about anything else, right? And there's other kind of historical reasons for that, and Orientalism and all that. So one of the things that I was kind of really conscious about, that I tried to be careful about, was even though I'm American Muslim, I was not going to make judgments in my work about what counts as Islamic pilgrimage, right? If somebody identifies as Muslim and they do a pilgrimage, then I include it in my book, because it's only up to Allah to decide, right, who's Muslim or not, right? And Western scholars often do this thing of like, oh, these people are Muslim, these people really aren't Muslim, these people are this group, these people are that group, right? One of the other things that I kind of talked about in my book quite a bit was how Western scholars often use typologies, right, or classifications. So for example, there's one typology that classifies pilgrimages in 6 categories: devotional, instrumental, normative, wandering, the walking around, initiatory, and obligatory. But one of the problems with this is that when people go on pilgrimage, it's not necessarily one thing. You might have an obligation to go on Hajj, but you might also be doing it for devotional reasons, right? Or a Shi'i might go to Karbala for like 3 or 4 reasons, right? And so one of the things I argue for in my book is that we need to collapse these categories, right? Because they're really created by the West, and they don't really make sense for Muslims, right? Because Muslims have a variety, just like any other religious people, of going on pilgrimage. Sometimes people go on Hajj because it's one of the pillars of Islam. Sometimes people go on Hajj because maybe their father died, and they go on Hajj because their father was not able to complete Hajj, so they want to kind of do Hajj for them, right? There's a variety of things, right? And so I think that one of the things I learned while doing this project was that there's a complexity of religious experiences, right? And that one of the things that tells us is that we need to interrogate or question the categories that are used, right? And make sure that we're being respectful about all these other traditions that people are doing and not placing our own judgments on these traditions. And in the West, the main thing that happens in what we call the academy or in scholarship is that people kind of place their kind of Western biases or their ideas about what counts as religion on other people. And the problem with that is those categories, they work really great for Protestant Christianity, but they don't work outside of Protestant Christianity. They don't even work for Catholics, right? And this is a problem we talk a lot about in the U.S., right? So I think that, what I tried to do in my book was kind of talk about these complexities and challenge them a little bit in each chapter. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about how I organized the book so you can kind of have an idea, and then maybe open it up for questions. So before I kind of talk about that organization, I'm not able to talk about the book as a whole because the book used 289 sources, and there was 777 footnotes, right? And so I can't, go through each chapter, but maybe if I give you a broad picture of what the project's about, that will be helpful. So to begin with, I have an introduction that's called Beyond Hajj, right? And the argument I make in that introduction is that when we think about Islam and we think about pilgrimage, and of course you all know this because you live in Indonesia, it is a broad category of experiences, right? And that's really the argument that's made there. Now, in the chapter 1, I titled it Reconsidering Islamic Pilgrimage, Theoretical and Sectarian Debates. Okay, so what I do in this chapter is I define ziyarat. Is that how I pronounce it? Ziyarat. Okay. And then I have a section, Islamic debates surrounding ziyarat, right? So you have a variety of perspectives that are quite different, ranging from, any ziyarat is fine to no ziyarah are okay. You know, there's some people that are like, any ziyarah besides Hajj is haram, right? And so I talk about all those, and then I talk a little bit at the end about how do we, as scholars, talk about Islamic orthodoxy, right? Because orthodox is a Protestant category, right, that's then placed on other religions. So how do we really talk about this, right? And so to kind of push that a little bit, and I was purposely being provocative here, like purposely looking at groups that identify as Muslim, but a lot of Muslims don't consider them Muslim. I talk about Nation of Islam, which is a NOI, which is a American, African American, black, basically pride movement, right? That has a lot of kind of Islamic theology in it, and that's what Malcolm X was in before he left, became Sunni, right? They actually have their own pilgrimages to, like, the grave of Malcolm X and the grave of the founders, right? I talk about the Ahmadiyya, a very controversial group, but they have their own pilgrimages. They aren't allowed to do Hajj. It's illegal for them to go to Mecca. So they have their own ziyarat that they do in Pakistan and India, right? And then I also talk about the Baha'i. The Baha'i do not identify as Muslim, and a lot of Muslims are like, they're, you know, bid'ah, right? Because the founder declares himself as a new prophet, right? But what's really interesting, about the Baha'i is that their pilgrimage to Israel, they have a pilgrimage site in Israel. They do the same things that people do at Hajj, right? And so I kind of wanted to talk about even groups that are influenced by Islam. So that's the first chapter, okay? So the second chapter, instead of doing a chapter that's just on Hajj, I did a chapter on the early pilgrimage centers, Jerusalem, Mecca, Medina, right? And a lot of scholars and a lot of people that study Islam in the U.S., they don't know that at the beginning, when people went to Mecca, they did it as a whole network of pilgrimages, right? They also don't know at the beginning, a lot of people in the U.S. don't know that at the beginning, Muslims did not pray towards Mecca. They prayed towards Jerusalem. And we know that from a variety of textual sources and also the placement of bodies in graves. Okay? And so fairly early on in Islam, they changed the direction of prayer. But at the beginning, Jerusalem, Al-Quds, is like incredibly important, and it remains important, right? It's still a very important place, right? So I talk about those in chapter 2. So in chapter 3, I have a whole chapter on the Shi'i pilgrimages, right? And so one of the things I try to talk about in this chapter is why do we privilege, or why do we only focus on 12er Shias, right? It's not Ashariya Shias. Those are the ones that we have like dominant in Iran, Iraq, and there's actually a big population in Afghanistan, there's a big population in Saudi, and some other places. So why do we do that? So there's a variety of other Shi'i groups, right? So the Shi'is believe in 12 imams, who they kind of view as mystical teachers, right? Kind of as wali. And they believe that if you go visit the graves of the imams, who are all related to Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, you receive barakat, right? However, outside of the Ithna Ashariya, we have the Zaydi, sometimes called the Fivers, and Ismaili, right, called the Seveners, right? And they have different beliefs. Ismaili don't really do pilgrimage. They believe that if they meet the Aga Khan, who's the head of their community, that is ziyarah, to gaze on the face of the living imam, they call them, right? And again, I don't make judgments about what is Islamic, what is not, right? At the end of this chapter, I talk a little bit about the Alevis and the Alawiyah, which are two distinct groups that people often get them confused, right? So the ladies are kind of like a Sufi order, a tariqa that's mixed with kind of Turkish local traditions, and very Sunni, but they have a lot of images of the imams, right? So it's hard, again, with a lot of these groups, how do we classify it? How do we classify them? They're not really Sunni, they're not really Shi'i, they're not really Sufi, they're kind of everything. And then the other groups I talk about are the Alawiyya. The Alawiyya kind of have a bad reputation now because Bashar Assad is Alawiyya, right? But the Alawiyya are a wide group with lots of followers, and they're primarily located in Syria and Turkey, right? But both of these groups, Alawiyya and Alevi, they take their name from Ali, right? So there's some Shiism going on there, right? But, they don't identify as Shia. There's something else, right? So the fourth chapter is on Sufi and shared pilgrimages. And one of the things I talk about in this chapter are contestations, how people argue about identity. So this is a really difficult kind of topic because the way that Western scholars classify Sufis is under mysticism. Mysticism is an invented category that British Orientalists invented, they came up with, because they didn't know how to describe what they saw in India. So they're like, and it's the same thing with Hinduism. That Hinduism is something that they came up with to describe all the religions in India because they could not understand. Very different from Protestantism, right? Hinduism. And so they kind of came up with this idea of mysticism. So when Western scholars talk about Sufism, they often say, oh, it's a kind of mysticism, right? But Muslims would not say, so if somebody was like a Naqshbandiya, they would not be like, I'm a mystic. They wouldn't say that, right? They might say, my sheikh taught me this special prayer. My sheikh helps me get barakat, right? And so I talked about that quite a bit. And this was kind of a complicated chapter because a lot of Sufi pilgrimages, maybe it's better just to say they're Muslim pilgrimages, but they're also shared pilgrimages. So there's a lot of places that scholars have written about that are, they say this is a Sufi pilgrimage. There's Muslims that go there. Sometimes there's Christians that go there. Sometimes, like in South Asia, there's Hindus that go there. I know there's some sites like this in Indonesia, right, where different people come together for barakat, right? In the Mediterranean, there's even some sites where Jews and Muslims go. One of the really famous sites in Turkey is the place where Maryam went after Jesus was killed. Okay? And it's on the coast, and it's on a mountaintop, and there's a lot of Christians that go there from all over the world, and a lot of Muslims. And that's where it's believed that she lived, right, to escape persecution after Isa was crucified. Prophet Isa was crucified, right? And so, this is one of those things where it's important to be kind of careful, I think. The scholars need to be careful in how they talk about these pilgrimages, because if you just say it's like a Sufi pilgrimage, you don't necessarily know what that means, okay? So the last chapter is about tourism, space, and technology, right? And the first part of this kind of focuses on the idea of the center. So we have a very famous scholar who passed away a long time ago, whose last name was Turner, right? And anthropologists. There was a husband and wife, and they were Catholic scholars, and they came up with this kind of idea of communitas, right? And you go to the site, and you all are like together, and you experience communitas, right? And one of the things that the Turners wrote about a lot was the idea of center, right? So this is a really interesting idea, right? That when pilgrims go on Ziyarah or go on Hajj or whatever, they leave one place and they go to like the center, that's the center of like religion and power and like mysticism and all of that, right? So that's a really useful idea, except there's a lot of pilgrims in Islam and in other traditions where they don't really use the center, okay? And one of the ways that this works is they do what's called a virtual pilgrimage. So a virtual pilgrimage is where they have, like, let's say an icon of somebody, and they have it in their home, and they maybe do meditation, or they have it in the room where they do salah, and they believe that when they do it, it kind of transports them to the site where the saint is. Okay, that's very common with a lot of Shi'i groups, a lot of Sufi groups, very common with like the Alawiya, the Levi. In Iran, they have a lot of these things called the Shama'il, which are Arabic term for portable icons, and they carry them around with them, right? So the center doesn't necessarily work. They're not going to a center physically. They're going to a center emotionally and religiously, right? And then the kind of last thing I talk about in this chapter is cyber Hajj and cyber pilgrimages. So one of the things that technology has kind of given pilgrims, and that includes pilgrims in Islam, is this idea that if you don't have enough money, or like your health is too poor, or it's too far, you can do pilgrimage online, right? And they actually have these computer programs now, right? Where you can like go to a site online and kind of virtually walk around and do the site, right? Now this is not the only way that technology is used, but one of the kind of points I make in this chapter is that technology is giving Muslims, a lot more options for doing pilgrimage. So, in the past, it's like the only way that you could do pilgrimage was to physically go. In the old days to Hajj, it was like you go on camels, or you go on horses, or you walk, right? Then we have, mass transportation, we have boats, we have airplanes, we have all that. But there are still people that cannot afford, lots of people, I'm sure, in this country, and in a lot of other countries that cannot afford to go on Hajj, right? And then there's people that maybe they're too sick, right? Like maybe they're diabetic, or maybe they're a cancer patient. They can't go on Hajj. So this is kind of a way that people can do something and still have some kind of, it's not Hajj, but it makes them feel connected to the Prophet. It makes them feel connected to Prophet Ibrahim and all those sites, right? And so to kind of conclude, the last thing I talk about in my book is I have like an afterword, right? I have this last section. And basically what I argue for is that I think that scholars need to make a transition from the textual, from just doing the textual, to doing what's called material religion, okay? So material religion is like, what do people use? How does their body interact with the sites, right? How do they get baraka or barakat? All of these things. And there has been at least in Western scholarship, there has been what we've called a material turn, where there's been this like turn from just focusing on the textual to focusing more on the material. So I don't actually argue that we abandon the textual, right? Because obviously the Quran and Hadith and Sunnah and all that are very important, but that we also include the material, right? I will save kind of the rest of my comments for Q&A, but that is kind of what I wanted to present to just kind of get our conversation started. Thank you.